The soul. It's a concept which has captured the minds of many great thinkers, and many religions and systems of philosophy and spirituality have sought to understand better what exactly the soul is. But what exactly is this thing that we call the soul? Is it really a thing? Does it actually exist? And how can we know of its existence if it does, in fact, exist? You see, there is a dimension, there is an aspect to our existence which is beyond our mere material bodies. Since time immemorial, man has been on this earth. Man has been in a competition for survival. Man has been in a competition to thrive and reproduce and multiply. And this competition has led to the extinction of countless species, with the result that man eventually came out on top and became successful in making the earth his dominion. That makes man sound like this brutal Darwinistic being who conquered the worlds through his might and terror. But that isn't necessarily the case, and it would be quite improper and rather naive to reduce the human condition and the broader human existence and experience to a mere Darwinistic competition. You see, we have these emotions, these needs, these feelings, these sorts of senses of belonging, this sense of fulfillment and purpose, this sense of us drawing meaning from things which are beyond and higher than us, and indeed much more transcendental and abstract than the material world, anyways. As we can see, for example, from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, beyond the basic requirements of life, we seek to actualize ourselves and bring about greater fulfillment in our lives via such abstract and transcendental notions as fulfillment and self realization, or certain psychosocial needs that we have. As such, there is a more, let's say, spiritual aspect to our existence. This kind of immaterial aspect to who we are as people that transcends mere material reality. What exactly is this nature of this kind of spiritual existence of ours, though? Some have termed this kind of spiritual aspect to our existence, or this immaterial aspect to our existence, the soul. And many of the great philosophers of the past have attempted to prove the existence of the soul. For example, you have the thought experiment that Ibn Sina or Avicenna proposed, which was the idea of the floating man, which was a thought experiment that essentially, even if a man was to not have any of his senses, right, if a man had no means of knowing himself, he would still consciously or subconsciously rather, he would still be aware of his self and of his own existence. And he used that to prove that the soul existed. Other philosophers like Aristotle and Aquinas sought to say that the soul gave birth to this kind of growth that human experiences throughout life. Or Aristotle or Aquinas attempted to say that the soul essentially could be proven philosophically, let's say. All of these philosophers sought to prove that philosophically or metaphysically we could prove that the soul exists. However, that is not necessarily the case because in all truthfulness, we cannot prove with certainty, or we cannot establish with absolute certainty, at least from certain philosophical arguments, that the soul really does exist. But what we can do is we can see that the soul, on an intuitive basis, makes much sense to us. It's generally speaking a mass transmitted belief or a matter of consensus amongst most of the major cultures and civilizations of the world that they believe in this thing called the soul, of this kind of spirit of man that embodies him, that is part of his existence, and this kind of continuity that continues even after the passing of the material body, but that it's difficult to describe what exactly it is. And philosophical arguments of these nature tend not to impart any kind of certainty. At best, they are allegorical or symbolic and cannot really prove with any degree of certitude that the soul really does exist. And what would the precise nature of the soul even be in the first place? Materialists and those who believe in physical causes tend to propose that, let's say, the mind or consciousness are the results of physical processes, and the soul does have not have any part in them whatsoever. The soul does not play a part in those processes of the mind, of consciousness. But we could respond to that. A person who believes in the soul could respond to that and say to that how can random, non-rational physical matter give birth to rational processes? How exactly is it that these random physical, non-rational things came about in the perfect way, supposedly, to bring about these rational faculties and give birth to rationality? That in and of itself does not make sense. And so, on a philosophical level, a contention that could possibly be raised is that it is only through the immaterial, a soul, that we could explain the arising of consciousness and the arising of rationality. Otherwise, we would have to contend with the fact that if, let's say, for the sake of argument, that physical processes, mere random physical processes, really do give birth to, let's say, consciousness and rationality, then surely that would be then what would be the case is that, you know, these rational processes could not necessarily be trusted because they wouldn't necessarily be conducive to truth. They wouldn't necessarily be conducive to seeking the truth. They would be conducive to things that are convenient for one's own survival, for one's own accumulation of resources, for one's own ability to win out in this kind of natural competition between species. It would not lead to truth per se, but that would go against our fundamental intuitions and understandings of human curiosity and of our seeking those truths, those pieces of knowledge which do not necessarily benefit us in our quest for survival. For example, the very abstract points of mathematics, the very theoretical workings of the natural sciences, the very abstract thoughts of poets and writers within the humanities. None of these benefit us on an intuitive level, yet we do seek them out as part of our natural human curiosity. And so one could very easily contend that these processes of consciousness and rationality, as they could not simply come about through these random, non rational physical forces, have to come about from something immaterial, from the soul. Again, I am not necessarily saying whether these arguments are right or not. I am simply presenting these arguments that some may make for the soul, giving some critiques, giving some pros and cons for it, and then letting the audience decide whether they want to take these on board or not. Regardless, what I would personally say is this: there is a kind of spiritual dimension to our existence, but we cannot necessarily know of it in a dogmatic manner. We cannot know of this spiritual dimension with certainty, let's say. Although philosophers in the past have tried to prove this spiritual dimension, the soul, it's been a very difficult thing to do. And we can't understand exactly the nature and the functions of such a spiritual dimension. If you don't believe in an immaterial dimension to our existence, it does raise a few philosophical contentions, although there are responses to those contentions as well. What I would say then is that whilst we can affirm the existence of this spiritual dimension to our existence, the soul, it is difficult for us to understand its nature, and ultimately we cannot fully understand or comprehend what exactly it is. As the Quran asserts, and they ask you about the soul, say it is from the affair of your Lord, and you have been not granted from knowledge about it except little.